Buenos Aires, January 2006. The city was restless. The air heavy, thick with summer heat, and heavier still with something more invisible, distrust. Argentina was still bleeding from its darkest financial wound. Only 5 years earlier, in 2001, the nation had collapsed under the weight of debt, corruption, and desperation. Ordinary people had lined up outside banks, banging pots, screaming at armored doors that refused to give back their savings. Accounts were frozen, life savings erased in the blink of a bureaucrat's pen. Families that had spent decades building modest wealth were left in ruin. The scars ran deep. Banks, once seen as safe havens, had become symbols of betrayal. If you asked the average Argentine what the word banco meant in 2006, many would have said, theft. And yet, in the affluent suburb of Acasuso, just north of the capital, the wealthiest citizens of Buenos Aires continued their rituals. The modern glass-and-stone Banco Rio branch stood among tree-lined streets, fashionable cafes, and high-walled villas worth millions. It was a fortress on the outside. Inside, it was a treasure chest, filled with cash, jewels, and hundreds of private safety deposit boxes belonging to the elite. On Friday, January 13, 2006, the branch was crowded. Retirees waited to withdraw their pensions. Businessmen lined up to settle accounts before the weekend. Families came to deposit valuables in the vaults below. To them, it was an ordinary day. But in the shadows of that wealthy suburb, a group of men were preparing to rewrite Argentina's criminal history. They weren't brutal gangsters. They weren't reckless. They were something rarer, a team of quiet, meticulous men, led by someone unlike any criminal Argentina had ever seen. His name was Fernando Araujo. He wasn't a gangster. He wasn't even a career thief. He was an artist. And on that summer day, he was about to transform the idea of a bank robbery into something no one had ever seen before. Part crime, part theater, part magic trick. It would last 6 hours. It would humiliate the police. It would mesmerize a nation. And even today, nearly 20 years later, Argentines still call it what it was, el Robo del Siglo, the robbery of the century. Fernando Araujo didn't fit the mold of a criminal. Born into a middle-class family, he was a wiry, restless man in his mid-30s. He taught martial arts, smoked marijuana, painted surreal canvases. He played chess with obsessive intensity. His mind was always working, solving puzzles, seeing patterns where others saw chaos. He believed reality was flexible, that it could be bent like clay if you applied enough imagination. For him, crime wasn't about greed. It was about creating a story. Something beautiful, something audacious, something unforgettable. In late 2004, after reading stories about Argentina's crumbling trust in banks, Araujo began sketching out a plan. A robbery, yes. But not just any robbery. He wanted to create a performance. A crime that would humiliate the police, captivate the public, and stand forever as a work of art. He began assembling a crew. Like a director casting a film, he chose carefully. He wanted men with clean records, low profiles, and specific skills. The locksmith, a man who could manipulate vault locks. The forger, who could create disguises, false IDs, and tools. The getaway expert, a driver who knew the city's veins better than anyone. The safecracker, quiet, meticulous, with hands like a surgeon. He recruited 5 men in total. None were famous criminals. None were flashy. They were ordinary men with extraordinary precision. And together, they began to design not just a robbery, but a show, a spectacle of control, deception, and escape. For nearly 2 years, Araujo worked like a painter on canvas. The target, Banco Rio in Acasuso. Wealthy clients. Hundreds of millions in valuables. A vault connected to the city's sewer system. The plan was bold: stage a fake hostage crisis upstairs to distract police, while downstairs the real operation unfolded in silence. Then vanished through a secret tunnel into the city's storm drains, leaving police and reporters stunned. This wouldn't be violence. This wouldn't be chaos. This would be a magic trick. Friday, January 13, 2006. At 12:30 p.m., four masked men walked calmly into the Banco Rio branch. Air masks were absurd, carnival wigs, painted faces, almost comical. But in their hands were weapons that looked terrifying: shotguns, pistols, rifles. One robber fired a shot into the ceiling. It was a blank. Customers screamed, diving to the floor. Staff froze. The robbers shouted, "Todos al piso!" Everyone on the ground. Within minutes, police cars screeched to a halt outside the bank. Sirens echoed through the suburb. Within half an hour, 200 officers and SWAT surrounded the building. Helicopters hovered overhead. Snipers took positions on rooftops. News cameras rolled. Argentina watched live as the siege unfolded. It looked like a nightmare: armed men with hostages, police preparing for bloodshed. But what nobody knew, not even the hostages, was that the real weapons were toys. Plastic, painted black. Their bullets were blanks. The men weren't killers. They were performers. And the real robbery had already begun. For the next 6 hours, the robbers staged an elaborate theater. They shouted demands: food, a getaway car, helicopters. They released hostages slowly, one by one, like actors on cue. They even treated some hostages kindly, offering water and reassurance. Meanwhile, negotiators outside sweated. They believed they were dealing with a dangerous, heavily armed gang. Reporters broadcast breathless updates, dozens held inside. Shots fired. Police preparing to storm the bank. Inside, the truth was very different. While the theatrics played out upstairs, downstairs in the vault, the safecracker and locksmith worked in silence. Deposit boxes clattered open. Cash, jewels, collectible coins, even rare artifacts filled duffel bags. At one point, a robber shouted from the lobby. In a rich neighborhood, without weapons or grudges, it's just money, not love. The line would become legendary in Argentina, a poetic riddle that summed up the crime. By evening, as the police grew restless, the bags were full. The stage play had served its purpose. Now it was time for the final act: disappearance. At 6:30 p.m., police prepared to storm the bank. Negotiations had stalled. Tension was at its peak. Heavily armed officers burst through the doors. They charged past frightened hostages, searching every room, every hallway. They expected gunfire. They expected blood. Instead, they found something else. The hostages were shaken, but unharmed. The weapons lying on the floor were plastic toys. The robbers? Gone. In the vault below, investigators found a hole. A narrow tunnel connected the bank's basement to the city's storm drains. The robbers had vanished into Buenos Aires' underworld, dragging nearly $20 million in cash and jewels with them. Down in the drains, the men moved quickly. They loaded the loot into inflatable boats, paddling through the dark tunnels. By the time police realized, they were miles away, already dispersing into the city. It wasn't just an escape. It was a disappearance. A magic trick performed in real life. Argentina erupted in shock. The police looked like fools. 6 hours of siege, 200 officers, helicopters, snipers, all outwitted by a handful of men with toy guns. The press called it immediately, El Robo del Siglo. The robbery of the century. For many Argentines, there was a strange satisfaction. Banks had stolen their savings. Now, someone had stolen from the banks. The robbers vanished into legend. For weeks, there were no arrests. The loot seemed to evaporate. The crew lay low, confident they had pulled off the perfect crime. But as with all crews, trust began to erode. Greed, jealousy, and fear cracked the unity. One robber's wife, angry at her husband, eventually tipped police. Investigators followed the trail, and arrests began. Yet, even as some crew members were captured, much of the money was never recovered. Araujo was eventually caught. In court, he remained defiant. He didn't apologize. He didn't beg. He described the robbery as a work of art. And in a way, it was. No lives lost. No blood spilled. Just audacity, planning, and deception. He served his sentence, and upon release, embraced the myth. He painted works inspired by the heist. He even consulted on a Netflix film dramatizing the robbery. The other members of the crew fared differently, some imprisoned, some vanished, some trying to live quietly. But their names, once ordinary, were now part of Argentina's folklore. The Banco Río robbery wasn't just a crime. It became a story Argentina needed to tell itself. To some, it was proof of corruption, that criminals walk free while ordinary people suffer. To others, it was folk revenge, the banks that stole from the people had finally been humiliated. And for crime historians, it was a masterpiece. A heist with no bloodshed, executed with precision, vanishing under the noses of 200 police officers. It was less like a robbery, and more like a chess match. And in that match, Fernando Araujo checkmated the entire system. Years later, when Netflix dramatized the robbery in El Robo del Siglo, Araujo himself served as consultant. He relived his greatest performance, not with shame, but with pride. And even today, if you walk the quiet streets of Acasuso, people still talk about that day. About the sirens, the helicopters, the crowd of neighbors watching. About the moment the police stormed in and found nothing but silence. The Banco Rio robbery endures not for the money stolen, but for the trick itself. It was theater. It was illusion. It was proof that sometimes, the system can be fooled not with bullets, but with imagination. In a world where most crimes leave blood in the streets, this one left a riddle. A line shouted in chaos, still quoted today. In a rich neighborhood, without weapons or grudges, it's just money, not love. The question remains, whispered across Argentina nearly 20 years later, was it crime or was it art?